Welcome to the EarthWorks Podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another EarthWorks Podcast. We're going to do a little bit differently. I kind of roped Kirk Kastner, our sales manager, into reluctantly participating in this one, but he's got a lot to offer, I think, in this subject matter. So we're calling this one, You've Got One Shot to Do It Right. And we wanted to talk a little bit, maybe internally, about our experiences with clients and their construction projects. There's been so much going on the last couple of years that kind of wanted to do a little bit of a round table and talk about the success stories that we've seen in our area. Joel and I just got off a conference call with one of our clients in California that really set himself up well with construction of the first 9, and he's got another one coming. So we're excited about that. Joel, Kirk, thanks for joining. I guess I'm the moderator here. So
your
thanks
show.
for jumping on.
It's all yours, pal.
It's all yours.
Yeah. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with you, Joel, and maybe just kind of go back in history a little bit as to how our products like Renovate Plus came about. I know it was a conglomerate of things, and some people on the ground, superintendents said, can you combine this? So kind of talk about that. And specifically, you and I were talking offline. I'd like to, we know that our compost is incorporated. We know that Ecolite's in there. We'll talk about that, but I want to talk specifically, maybe for my own information, about the mineral portion of that product in particular and why that's beneficial for us. So take it away.
Well, you guys know probably more than anybody, but certainly anybody listening has heard me talk a number of times about how much Jerry Brunetti, my partner in crime here, really emphasized the remineralization aspect. So, what happened was, it was kind of interesting, and I've shared this story, I think, once or twice maybe on the podcast, but it's worth repeating. Back in the 90s, all the mixes, early 90s was when we were starting to play with this. The early mixes were peat moss blended. There was a couple controversies about people taking peat moss and flipping it in with a rhododendron, and it was really miserable. And quite honestly, I don't think anybody in the industry would suggest or recommend that anybody try to flip peat moss. I mean, if you've ever tried to do this, and I don't know if Kevin, you ever did, but it's like trying to herd cats. I mean, it's just it's so light and fluffy that it's not doable. Yep. So, we got a lot of grief because we started coming in saying, let's flip in, some amendments. And that got a lot of the folks, especially at the USGA, all up in arms because they just didn't like the idea of incorporating anything. But when you look at what we're doing, and I'll get to that here in a second, and certainly it takes most of your airtime. When we're flipping in things with high bulk densities like we're doing, they really incorporate it well. And a rhododendron has been the tool of choice for most superintendents. And we were trying to count this. We've got to have done over 1,000 or more. I don't even know how to start with that count. Construction projects since the inception of EarthWorks. But what happened was, so mid-90s, now we started getting the California mix, straight sand. And superintendents were coming to us and say, man, and they were petrified. I mean, this was the brainstorm of a bunch of folks, just straight sand and, all this kind of stuff. And, and superintendents would come to us and say, hey, they're petrified. I mean, they were strong enough agronomically to know that this wasn't going to be a good thing. So Jerry and I sat down and said, okay, so what does a soil have that a soilless medium doesn't have? Well, it kind of broke down into 3 parts. It has a CEC, holding capacity, right? So usually you get that from clay particles and soil and all those kind of things. It has an organic matrix, and you and I will talk about that, Kevin, because we just looked at a soil coming out of the chute from Justin, and it was 1% organic matter, which is phenomenal for a brand new green. And the third thing that a soil has that a soilless medium doesn't have, it has a mineral matrix. So we sat down and said, okay, how do we kind of build a program that mimics a soil and a soilless medium? And we had just started working with Ecolite at the time, which is the zeolite mineral. And the zeolite mineral, for those of you who don't know it, Ecolite is the brand name, but it is a zeolite mined mineral, and it's a crystal. So it has the ability to hold moisture, but it also has a great ability to release it. But it has also, so it gives you that water management that, theoretically we get from peat moss. But it also has a very, very strong holding capacity. So the CEC, or the holding capacity of zeolite, is about 4x what you would get from a calcined clay or from a diatomaceous earth. So, and we happen to like, actually we happen to love Ecolite because it's been a big plus for us for all these years.
Right.
And the other benefits of that is it also happens to hold, it happens to be a reservoir for potassium and for ammonium nitrogen. So it keeps it from, keeps the nitrogen from volatilizing. And we should talk about this, but certainly in calcareous sand mixes, having Ecolite in there is going to bring a reservoir for potassium to balance that potassium sodium, ratio in the soil. So that was the holding capacity. And then we said, okay, well, let's build an organic matrix. And usually we build and you guys have both seen me talk about this in the academies, but I always build a pyramidal, a carbon pyramid, which would have a short chain carbon at the top, a medium chain carbon in the middle, and then a longer chain carbon, so that we have constant carbon feeding, if you will. But with construction, we wanted to do that backwards. We wanted to do it upside down. So we used a lot of very quickly available carbon sources as the base of the thing, but that was the majority because we wanted that carbon to be there and be able to burn up during the construction, during the grow-ins when you're pushing nitrogen, because you're going to push nitrogen. And we wanted to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we used things like kelp meal and other meal products, and we used sugars, and we used compost from our egg layer. We have carbon in there from humic acids, which again aren't available food sources, but very supportive of the process. So we built this pretty amazing carbon complex. And then the third step on this was having a very rich mineral package. So we started with things like black rock phosphate, which doesn't exist anymore, green sand, which is glauconite, sulfomag, calcium, as many minerals as we could get. And you guys weren't around when we were doing this, but when we started this project, we were bringing in all of those raw materials as separate entities. And I'll quote Pete Wendt. When Pete was doing Kinloch, Pete was, and I might not want to say this. Hopefully he's not going to listen, but he probably will. Pete was the last guy at Kinloch where we did all this, where we literally brought in 20 different products, and then each one had to get flipped in kind of individually. And then as we were going through that, another superintendent in that Virginia area was starting to do some construction, and he said, hey, I'm going to put this through a blender, which was not common at the time. We weren't getting a lot of blending of our amendment package. And he goes, well, look, I'm going to a blender. I'm going to have them blend it instead of ripping it in with a rhododendron. And he goes, can you put it all together in one bag? And so that I only get charged for one incorporation price for the blending. And I'm like, oh, that's actually pretty brilliant. Wonder where I was. And then we did it. And then I remember going and having a cocktail with Pete, and he was pissed. He was like, what the hell are you talking about? I had to go through this and that. And of course, I just interviewed one of his guys from Kinloch yesterday for the podcast. And, all those guys were like, yeah, we had to open all those damn bags. And it was blah, blah, blah. But the point is, and the real message here is that what we were trying to accomplish was to mimic a soil and a soilless medium with those three steps: having a CEC with the Ecolite, having a really good, available carbon thing, an upside down pyramid. So again, we wanted to have that. When nitrogen was being pushed, we weren't growing a lot of thatch, and that's really one of the great benefits of having this amendment package. Right. We don't grow in with a lot of thatch. We grow in with a lot less nitrogen because there's a lot of available carbon there to get the nitrogen that we do use all the way through nitrification. And if you think about this, if you're trying to grow in with a lot of nitrogen, there's no carbon there to balance the seed-to-end ratio. So you have to push a lot of carbon. I mean, Kevin, you've certainly been around long enough to know that, the old adage was 10 or maybe even 20 pounds of nitrogen through the, first, number of months to get the growing process, to get it up, get it established, fill it in. But the one thing that you really came out of the chute with in that process was a 4 or 5 inch layer of thatch that was a
Right.
night.
Well, even still today, a lot of people are recommending 6 to 8 pounds on
Yeah.
cool season, and Kirk, I'm going to tap you here in a minute
Right.
on warm season grow-ins, but that's because it's not efficient nitrogen, right? So we're
Right.
bringing the efficiency with the biology. But I want to back up just a second because I think there's a couple of things that you mentioned in there that probably don't have a lot of great understanding. And when I hear when people hear green sand, they think, oh,
Right.
for divot mix.
Yeah, right.
No, not that
Nope.
green sand.
No,
So pause on that and talk about that ingredient specifically and what it brings to the table.
green sand, it's called glauconite. That's the
Right.
mineral. And it's harder to find anymore because a lot of these raw minerals we're losing. Like black rock phosphate, we used to love, and that was a phosphorus mined mineral out of
Yeah.
a very dense. The black part was carbon, obviously. Green sand is a mineral called glauconite, and it's a potassium silica, but it's a mica-like structure. So it brings not only this reservoir and availability of potassium, but it also has a huge physical value because of
Right.
that mica structure. Water and microbes can kind of find a home within the lattice of that mineral. So it really was it was one of Jerry's favorite minerals, and we used to mine it out of mines here in New Jersey. And it was wonderful. We still are able to find it. It's getting a little harder, and we found that mineral package has changed slightly just based on availability, but the concept has never changed.
Sure.
And the one thing that I think I want to stress hard on this is that a lot of people, well, these minerals are not going to be available for 100 years, and there's a certain level of truth to that, obviously. But when a plant spits out organic acids looking for phosphorus or looking for potassium or looking for something, it has the ability to dissolve the mineral package that we put into the mix, or the mineral that is inherently in a soil. In the Midwest, where these big soils with lots of mineral, the plant can go and find that mineral. Even though you put it in water, it's not going to be soluble, but the plant has that ability, and that's what a plant does. It spits
Yeah.
out these very acidic organic acids so that it can purposely find the nutrient that it knows it needs so that it can survive. So the mineral package, again, was the one thing that Jerry was really adamant about, and has always been a big part of EarthWorks. I mean, every product that EarthWorks makes is very mineral dense, either coming from the chicken or through addition of material. But it's very important, and glauconite is a wonderful mineral, but again, it's not a green colored sand. It doesn't look like
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah.
look like sand.
Well, and I think the counter to the argument or the criticism that it's not going to be available for X amount of years, it plays to our advantage in the long run, especially when you're talking about the compost component and the ecolite component, because
Yeah.
what's the alternative? It's a peat moss. Well, guess what? In year 2 or 3, that's burned out, and it leaves you with fairy ring and really no value. I was just talking with a sand supplier this morning, and we were talking about pricing and offsetting, one component with another component. And really, if you get these long-term amendments incorporated into a greens mix, you can offset the cost of it by reducing the amount of peat and including these long-term beneficial amendments into the mix. So Kirk, you and I deal a lot with poor water quality. Western soils are a real different animal than what Joel sees a lot of. Joel and I were just looking this morning at new greens up in the mountains in Utah, and highly calcareous, but also pretty low on mineral as well. But where you are, you're growing primarily. I mean, you definitely see some cool season, but you're doing primarily warm season. What differs in your recommendations when you're talking to superintendents or field managers and they're looking for amendments?
And before you get going, Kirk,
it's-
let me qualify. I mean, Kirk is in the Dallas market, so he's in Texas. Kevin, of course, is out on the West Coast, and I'm out on the East Coast. So we kind of cross the whole country here. But Kirk, you're definitely in a unique area what has some unique challenges. So I just want to
absolutely. I mean, anytime we see these calcareous soils, that causes unique challenges. So we're constantly chasing magnesium and potassium, which is which is always an issue. And you throw in the poor water quality, and this is one of the you know uh, funnest parts of my job is to each of these construction jobs is so unique, right? So I learned so much from our customers and their goals and objectives, and um, what I've learned from you two here is basically you guys have probably forgotten more than I'll ever know on this. So um, we're constantly chasing those minerals and adding carbon into the system. Um, so I'm losing it here. So we're gonna have to take a break here.
Well, one of the things that when we're dealing with markets like yours, Kirk, is that you do have god awful water there. I mean, I remember when we were working with Casey when we were building Trinity and looking at some of that stuff there, and man, that was horrible. It was just so much brought into the equation that, luckily we were able to kind of buffer a lot of that, and that's really what this is all about, as much as anything, is when you bring these amendments into the greens mix. Or even into a tea mix, to be honest with you. And one of the areas that we learned as much of about construction as anywhere was with your guys at FC Dallas, with Troy Crawford and Alan Reed. I mean, I tell that story at a lot of academies when Troy was starting to, what does he have? 28 fields there.
Yeah, about 28 fields.
So every year he was building a new field, and every day that field is open, it's $1,000 of revenue to that organization. So he knew that he could get the construction amendments in there and open earlier because they would get established a little faster. So he started out pretty lightly. I mean, trying to figure out where the sweet spot was, and obviously there's there's a fear of the economics versus the agronomics. So he did a fairly modest incorporation, and I don't remember what it was. I'm sure he has it, but
we kind of tweaked it over time. It started a little bit lower, and then he kind of learned if he added a little bit more inputs in the beginning, that would shrink his closing time, and ultimately return more revenue for his organization. So it was about a 3-year process, and then by the end we had it pretty well dialed in, and we reduced it down from a closure of around 75 to 80 days down to almost a month.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that was the story that he told that I love so much, is that every new field, because he would be doing one a year, and the next one he'd do a little bit more, and he would open a little earlier. And so the ROI on this is phenomenal. I mean, the ROI on being able to open up, from 45 days to 30 or whatever the number is, that's $1,000 a day. That pays for itself. There's another story that I want to share. I remember vividly, and I think this was Pete when we were building Kinloch, and but we got together with the it might have been another superintendent, so don't hold me to that. Sorry, Pete, if I'm throwing you under the bus. But we were trying to decide whether or not peat moss is even valid, and peat moss at the time. Now this is going back into the probably early 2000s. It was costing almost $100,000 to get a 20% incorporation rate of just the peat moss and then get it in and do all that. Whereas this full-blown construction amendment program that we were looking at was about $20,000 or $30,000 less than that. And it brought so much more to the table. So, the conversation was, we're standing on a green with the superintendents and with the architect, and he goes, "Wait a second, you're saying if we take the peat out, we save $100,000 and we put this in, and we're only going to spend 60 to 80 or whatever the numbers were. It was less and a better growing." And they all looked at him and said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Oh, okay, I'm in. Let's play golf." And that was the end of the conversation.
Yeah, and I'll kind of play devil's advocate on that. I definitely I see the argument, and I totally understand it, that there's a safety net there, and a certain limited liability to the superintendent if he adheres to that long standing
and it's kind of like program. A CYA at this point.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
I get that, but we've also been able to tweak formulas and have a little bit of both in there, and like you said, Joel, offset that cost. But still get that long-term benefit.
I agree, and I don't talk to anybody, and I would recommend at least some peat moss, just if nothing else, to cover your butt.
Yeah.
But and it does provide some water moisturing management. But if you guys, and Kevin, you probably have done this, but if you've ever dug up an old green, 10, 15, 20-year-old USG green that had 20% peat moss, you'll see softball or bowling ball size clumps of that
Yep.
peat moss, because through that water movement in that profile, the peat just starts to do this. And that's where you start to get a lot of localized dry spots. You get hydrophobic conditions because now the peat moss has kind of moved and migrated and kind of attached itself to itself. And now you got these pockets of peat that, peat moss doesn't break down. It's not really a food source for microbe. It's not a carbon
Right.
source for microbes, but it does manage moisture. But we can get that with the Ecolite and by building humus and getting, the roots to digest correctly and not grow thatch. So, I mean, we're really getting a phenomenal material in there that really manages moisture and nutrition and all the things that you want through a growing.
That sand blender I was talking with this morning, he gave me the ratio for a 90-10, and I think it was reed sedge peat, but for his mixer or his blender, he's using one bulk bag per 65 tons of sand for a 90-10 blend. So you talked about bulk density or lack thereof,
lack
and
thereof,
the fact that stuff is so mobile. I remember, this is going to date me, back in 84, the club I was at the time, we lost greens, and it was, Kirk, you've probably never even heard of this, but it was called C15 decline.
Never heard
Joel,
of it.
you probably hadn't even been in the business, but it was
I've
related
heard of
to it was related to Toronto creeping bentgrass, which is a vegetatively established all throughout the upper Midwest, obviously originated in Toronto, but they called it the country club disease because it started in Chicago and moved its way west. And it's actually called bacterial wilt. That's the I guess the pathogenic name of it.
Well, that made a comeback. Probably 10 or 15 years ago. It was.
Yeah, it did. It did.
Even more recently,
yeah. But anyway, during that regrass, we had always used a 70-30 with some soil. There was this was Minnesota, so the soil was a little bit different, but it was a 70-30 blend, and we had a couple of greens prepped and ready to go prior to sodding them, and we got a deluge of rain, and all of that peat floated to the surface.
Yes, I can imagine.
Well, we didn't have time. We were under the gun. It was a fall project. Sod went down, and it never tacked, because now we had a 1/4-inch layer of peat that had floated up from the top inch of that root zone mix. The whole thing those two greens had to be redone because they just never took root.
Yeah, I mean,
we didn't have the aerification tools that we do now, and didn't have things to cultivate our way out of that. So it just, what a disaster.
Oh my God, that's a great story.
One thing, the bulk density, the bulk density
Right.
thing, I think in our products is a really important feature.
Yeah, I mean, it's all around 50 for most of that,
Right.
Whole package. So you get some density in there. It'll work its way down easily, and it's not gonna, once it's there, it doesn't really move.
Right.
And like I said earlier, even the that volume of available carbon that we would not normally want to work with, but for growing we do because of the carbon to nitrogen ratio, that'll get burned up. That'll get burned up in the first couple of years, but that's okay because you're replacing it with roots, and you keep, the biology working. You're going to keep that digestive property working. But, what we're trying to do is jumpstart this whole process and provide that imperative carbon in the soil, so that when we do have to put some nitrogen, there's something for it to bite into and go through nitrification. So,
Yeah.
it's
And
really
that's a good point, Joel, because I mean, more and more recently, these projects, the timelines are shrinking,
Yeah.
right? Everyone, they want to minimize the close time. They don't want the golf course down. They don't want to miss the revenue. So they push it. So inevitably, they're going to be pushing harder with the nitrogen, right? So it's good to we got to have that carbon in there to balance that out.
Yeah.
Kirk, do you see with these timelines shrinking, do you see, especially with the ultra dwarfs on greens, do you see, I would assume you see more sod than sprigging, or are they still using sprigs?
It's all sprigging. Yeah.
Okay.
At least on the greens. Right. And we've seen that go from, 12 down to, 8 to 10 weeks,
Right.
grown in and open. And that's kind of the timeline that they're pushing for right now.
And
You
again,
know,
it goes back to you've got one shot to make this thing right, So
yeah,
this is, it always baffled me. And I, we've had this internally, this question, but it always baffles me when, you're doing a $30 million project and you want to save $50,000 on the greens mix. I mean,
yep,
and an opportunity to get this thing open and strong. I mean, we just talked to Justin Mandan, who was pulling samples from his new greens of 6 months now. And he's saying he's having a hard time, getting the roots, he's pulling cups in there and he's having a hard time getting it out because the roots are so strong. And these are what, 6 months old? I mean, it's,
yeah,
yeah,
thereabouts.
he was just telling me that this morning and saying, man, it's exhausting how hard it is. I'm like, Justin, that's a good problem. I like that. That's
Yeah,
Right.
where it should
yeah. And speaking of him, I take a little bit different approach, I think, than you guys do on the grow-in side of things, and it's a practical thing for me but we all talk about it, that with that, like you said, Kirk, that carbon foundation or the carbon base, we certainly use synthetics
Oh,
in
yeah.
the growing process. There's
Absolutely.
there's
no way
always a
around it.
place for that.
Right. Right.
Well, you have to push. You have to get the grass
right.
established, and you need to push. You just don't need 10 pounds, and you don't want to come out of the chute with 4 inches of lignous thatch. I mean,
Right.
this is the construction, management. They come in, they just grow, their job is to grow it in, and then they leave everything for the super, and it's crap. I mean, it's 5 inches of thatch.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, and you mentioned Justin Mandan, he and I were talking prior to dropping seed, and he said, we had put together a grow-in program, and he said, I just don't know if it's enough in. And there isn't a better agronomist in this field
No,
than
there
him.
really
And
isn't.
I said, Justin, you will know when you need to step on the gas.
Right.
And
Yeah.
but it's so much easier to put more down than take it off,
Yeah.
and so I think that's the point that I try to get across with my customers is you build that foundation and that balance of carbon and nitrogen. It's easy sailing, and
Well,
and you can
let it do the work, right?
yeah, you can and
Yeah.
you can always
And
tickle it if you
you
need
can
to,
pull the
and
levers, and obviously,
totally.
the weather plays a big. There's a lot of variables in there, but yeah, that's let that do the work for you.
And these
Yep.
guys are getting a lot of pressure from, certain forces in the industry that are saying, just pound, pound, pound. And, and it's hard. It's hard not to, take that advice. And, it's a little frightening. You got a lot of responsibility and you got to get these things open. But the bottom line is, and most guys are good agronomists. Just eyeball it. When you need to push, then push, but don't be
Yeah.
afraid to push.
Yeah.
I mean, usually, Justin is a great example. When Justin comes to us, we just had this conversation this morning and says, I think I need to push. If he's saying he needs to push, he needs to push because
Right.
I mean, there's, we were talking about this as well, this whole adage of less is more, which is dangerous in my mind, the whole MLSN thing. That's dangerous when it comes to needing that push and that nutrition base. So, it's a matter of knowing that balance, and it's a learning curve. I mean, like Kirk said, we're learning constantly by working with these guys. I learned so much by working with Troy Crawford, FC Dallas. I mean, that was one of the best learning curves I've ever gotten from a guy who,
Right,
every year he built something new.
Yeah, he gave us the framework, for these sports
Right.
fields, grow in construction, and it's been incredible. And we're able to take that, all across all of our client base across the U.S. And it's been incredible to work with him, and learn from him. That's he's willing to do the work and try it and refine it constantly. And
But it's almost easier with guys like that because it's a dollars and cents decision.
Yes, it is.
Yep.
Right. And with golf, sometimes it's a little more touchy-feely, esoteric sort of concept. And the only dollars they're thinking about is saving it on the front end. And in the long run, you're going to spend a heck of a lot more time, energy, and effort and money trying to correct what you didn't do on the
and that goes back to you
end.
only got one shot to getting it right. And
Right.
and like Kirk was saying too, every golf course now is being pushed to open earlier and earlier and earlier. You got guys that are starting the grassing process, in the fall, and they're going to be open by May. I mean, that's just absurd. We did a project in Florida where that was the time frame, was they were going to open up super early in the spring and started the project in mid-October. And that time frame just isn't strong enough to really build that kind of system. So in that particular situation, we really went aggressive with the amendments, and luckily he was able to convince the owners that made sense so that they could open, and they did, and they opened up really strong. But if they had done even a modest amount of amendments or a conventional program, and he had to be open that early, it would have been a nightmare. He would have been devastated and just constantly chasing his tail, trying to stay ahead of it after construction. And again, remember, when you've got a new golf course or, any kind of a new seedling situation, think of it like this. These guys, these little seedlings are babies. For the first year, they're infants. They're not even off to preschool yet. They're still home, crying and screaming and yelling. I mean, they're just babies. And then all of a sudden you open up the golf course and you bring in 30,000 feet and you walk all over them and you drive all over them and you put a bunch of stuff down that's going to hurt the soil. And, I mean, it's an infant that you're dealing with. And for the first 3 years, the grow-in program, the grow-in process is a 3-year process. To really get it to the point where this thing is established and steady and sustainable. And that's an important, and again, that goes back to make the investment up front. And, I think we all agree. I mean, we're all in the same boat. It's challenging for us because we don't want to come off as we're trying to just sell all this stuff, which is the criticism, of course, that academia loves to throw at us because, that's what they think, that's all we're trying to do is make money. And again, Troy Crawford, as an example, I came in with a very modest program. He's the one that modified it, and for the right reasons, because he saw the benefit of it. So, and again, we've taken that and learned from it. So it's common sense if you think about it. If you can get a really good amendment package into your mix, you're going to have a much better growing. You're going to be stronger for years to come. And you can't do that after you got grass on the ground. You can't flip in 500 pounds of an amendment through an air fryer. It just isn't going to happen.
There's a project in my territory that's pending right now that Joel, you and I have worked on, that they had some consultants get involved and basically pulled any amendments out of the mix. It's a pretty substandard sand. We're talking dozens of soccer fields, and the field managers are up in arms because they know it's going to be an uphill battle for several years. But they were able to save some money on the front end, and
so we
they'll pay for it for years.
Academic, and he says, "Oh, you don't need anything but nitrogen," and everybody that's in our industry knows that. I have another great story that I want to share. I don't share very often, but we did a project down in Louisiana many years ago.
Thinking about that.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, that was one of the ones that really drove this home too. But it was a political situation. The superintendents and there was a bunch of politics between people, and there was a fraction that wanted amendments and a fraction that didn't want amendments. And so we started amending, and I think they got 15 greens done, and then the politics changed, and the fraction that didn't want amendments got in. And they actually came to us and said, "You have to take this stuff out of here." So there was still enough to do another 5 or 6 greens. And I had talked to the superintendent that was in charge at the time. He goes, "I got to tell you, Joel, the first 15 greens were spectacular. The last 5 greens that we did without the amendments, I chased every single time, and I hadn't seen him for years at the time of this conversation." He goes, "I chased those greens for years. They still, to this day, after years of this project being done, still to this day, you can see the difference in what, how they survive." And this was going years later. So there's longevity, there's legs that, having a good package in there. And think about the mineral package, that's going to be there forever, So, and you're building roots, you're building humus, you're building, you're getting humification working, which is key.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said a minute ago, Joel, with respect to, maybe speaking about greens in particular, but certainly goes with sports fields as well. And this was a critical error I made in my own career. But when when, especially with respect to sod, but I think the same can be said for a seeded field. When you get that traffic on there is one of those times, and I underestimated it, but it's one of those times when you do need to step on the gas a little bit.
Yeah.
And, that's been one of my lessons. Hey, do as I say, not as I do, with some of my clients now, that when you're ready to open that golf course, be prepared. And, some have heeded my warnings and my failures and been successful, and others have said, dang it, you were right. I should have tapped the gas a little bit more there. And, and I was talking yesterday with a rep of ours, and the same can be said for what we've seen in the last couple of years with increased traffic.
Yeah, exactly.
We've added 25% more traffic, whether it's soccer field or golf course, but we really haven't reflected that in our fertility. Well, the guys that have invested with a carbon fertility sort of program, we're definitely able to
survive
and manage that a lot easier. And it's not a testament necessarily to us or our products, but you've built that base and invested in that base, that when you've got some things that'll kind of rock you, it definitely helps you weather that storm a little bit.
I was talking to a friend who took their kids down to Disneyland the other day, and they were telling me the story of, that they were waiting to get in, and everybody was at the gate and waiting to get in, and then the doors open up and this huge river of people go running into the park. And I'm thinking that's kind of what happens on a new construction program. You grow and you grow, and then all of a sudden they open the gates, and this army of people come running over this young baby grass, and it's just, the physical pressure is unbearable. But yeah, you're right, that's where you do need to be able to understand how far you can push this, and we were again talking to Justin today. He did a little bit of soluble stuff, trickled it in through the last 6 months just to make sure that everything was ready to go. And he just played a tournament on that new grass a couple weeks ago, and it was spectacular. I didn't get a chance to see it, but I heard a lot of people talk about it. Did you see it?
I saw a little bit. The Western Collegiate Invitational is held there every year, and that first 9 that he finished renovating, it proved to be a really tough test for very good golfers. So that's good.
Yeah.
Hey, let's talk about specifics now. Kirk, you and I have talked a lot about this, about specific rates, but couple that with you talked about soil testing prior to dropping a mix in a green core, for instance.
Right.
What kind of rates are we talking about? What have you seen that that really? Obviously, we've all heard of the moron principle. If you put some down more, or if some is good, put more on. I guess that's what it is.
Yeah, that's right.
I tend not to subscribe to that, but at the same time, I think we've certainly done enough of these that there's a threshold that really leads to a pretty good success rate. So where are we talking for people that maybe haven't worked with us before?
Yeah, I like what we came up with. I think another thing that we learned, like from Brian, the 8 pounds per ton, which
that was a great lesson,
which is incredible, right?
I know.
So everyone is, like I said, is so unique in how they're doing it. If it's a total core, one just like rule of thumb that I like to lead with is 100 pounds per inch is kind of where I start of renovate plus, right? And depending on the situation, on the sand type or the soil, we might work some Ecolite in there as well. But that's kind of where I start, and then we see what the economics are. And I really like to lean into, like you talked about, the peat moss and the ROI. We leave some peat moss in there, but it's an alternative to peat moss, so we could pull back some of that peat moss, right? And there's still available funds there. So let's put it into something a little bit more comprehensive that's going to give you the physical nature of Ecolite and the mineral density and the carbon to complement the peat moss, right? So that's kind of where I lean into. The money is there. but let's use it wisely, right?
Yep.
That's kind of my starting point. And like I said, 100 pounds renovate plus per inch, and then tilling down anywhere, 3 to 6 inches.
or
Yeah.
even
And
more.
I like that.
And even more, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of guys want to have it blended, which is totally an option. I think it's easier on everybody to just send it to the sand supplier, have it blended at this ratio, and dump it in the cavity. But um, those bottom 8 to 12 inches, I feel like that could be utilized much more efficiently in those top 6 to 8
Right.
inches.
Right.
So
Right.
let's concentrate it up top. It's a little bit more work for the superintendent and the construction crew to till it in and flip it in and get it all right. But I feel like that's the best approach, in my opinion, and what we've had the best success with.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of not full renovations, but maybe resurfacings that are going
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
and that's where when you gave me that 100 pounds per inch
yeah,
number, that really resonated with me because a lot of it depended on what the level of disturbance is going to take place.
yeah,
What equipment do you have at your disposal? If a guy says, "Hey, all I have is a scarifier on a Sand Pro,"
Yeah.
well, that's going to dictate our
Indeed.
rate to a certain
Yeah.
degree. Because
right,
he's only going to
yeah,
be able to get an inch and a half, 2 inches. So
We started a lot of this in in the southern states when they were starting all the no-till work. They were
yep,
just
yeah,
coming in, rounding up the grass, and running an air fryer 3 times. And how much can you get
right,
in? You can't get a whole lot in. But even at an inch, at 100 pounds per inch, and maybe we're getting 2 inches in a no-till. We still had phenomenal growings when they got those sprigs into that soil. There was something, there's some meat on the bone that they were able to get these things going on, and they were able to turn these no-tills around weeks, if not months earlier than what normally was, assumed. And the whole idea behind a no-till was they shut down when nobody wants to play golf in the heat of the summer, and they try to get all this done and hope that they can be ready by September. And when they were starting to, when we started playing with these mixes and no-tills, man, they were ready. They were ready in that, in weeks instead
yep.
of months. And that's really, we learned a lot there. And again, you get one shot that gets, you get one shot
right,
at it. Or what does
So
Dave Wilbur say? It's
yeah,
you got six months to do 5 years worth of work.
yeah, and
which
that's
is
exactly right.
essentially the same concept,
Yeah,
right?
same concept. But I want to give Dave credit for that
yep.
because that was really
Yeah.
his quote.
Thank you, Dave.
Yes,
Yeah,
Dave.
thank you, Dave. Okay, so we've definitely covered our bases on Renovate Plus, but another piece of this puzzle is a mycorrhiza product, our Myco Replenish.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know how long that's been in our stable, but where does that fit, Joel?
Well, I mean that's the final piece of the puzzle. So the mycorrhiza we're going to put down on the surface. We're going to get it in, but there you can scratch it in. So it doesn't matter if you're growing in with sod or seed or sprigs. You want that in the first 2 or 3 inches because when when that root starts to come in there, that mycorrhiza will attach and go
Right.
into that root and then pull that root down in the ground and start finding phosphorus. And the important thing to remember with the mycorrhiza, and it's incredibly valuable, and it's so successful. The mycorrhiza, and Jack Higgins loves to use this phrase, is the biological starter fertilizer.
Yeah.
And one thing I really want to say, regardless of what mycorrhiza you're using, if you're putting down mycorrhiza, do not put down a lot of soluble phosphorus because
Yep.
the mycorrhiza's job is to go and find phosphorus. And if you come in behind this program and put a lot of starter fertilizer with a very high phosphorus content, first, a couple things are going to happen. First of all, that phosphorus will tie up very quickly. So it's ultimately not going to be all that available. But secondly, and maybe most importantly in this scenario, is that it shuts the mycorrhiza down. And you
Yep.
want that mycorrhiza. It's not only finding phosphorus, it's finding other minerals, and it's finding water, and it's pulling roots down deep into that soil. And I've told this story many times. Our dear friend Mark Newsom, who was a business partner of mine for years, he was manufacturing endo roots for years, which is a great product. And and they left our plant, and he came to me and said, "Hey, you guys should look into building a mycorrhiza product." I'm like, I don't believe in bugs in a jug. And he went around and around and trying to tell me and sell me on this thing. And then, of course, he finally said, "Well, we sold a lot of it." Oh, really? And so, but to answer your question, originally that might have only been 10 or 15 years ago that we've really been diving into it. And mycorrhiza and the myco replenish product is now certainly one of our biggest selling products, and one of my favorite. It's actually the backbone of our EarthWorks for Home program. And anytime any landscaper plants, you should be putting the mycorrhizae down. But this is the stuff. So in the mix, you're going to flip in renovate and hopefully, especially on calcareous, and we can talk about that further, you're going to mix in some additional ecolite. So you have that really good foundation in the soil, flipped in with a rhododendron or however it can be done, as deep as you can justify. And then when you're ready to plant and probably before final grade, throw the mycorrhizae down there and then seed right into it, or sod right into it, or sprig right into it, and let that plant run. And it will be a wonderful, wonderful growing. And that's the same backbone of our aerification program. It's the same process as renovate and myco into the holes, and recovery happens almost immediately. I mean, it's amazing how quickly an aerification hole can be filled in from dropping, 1 bag per green of myco replenish and renovate plus.
And
but
with very little nitrogen, right?
with no nitrogen.
Yeah, I mean, hardly any nitrogen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you, Kirk, with ultra dwarfs. I mean, I really try to talk superintendents in particular into having that be their starter fertilizer that goes down either prior to or during seeding versus a synthetic, because we know we're coming back in with more fertility in a short period of time. But does that suffice with the ultra dwarfs as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Let that be the foundation. And I love Jack's terminology with the the biological starter fertilizer. Just a well balanced, it's a 333 analysis. It's got all the goodies in there: trace package, trace nutrients, a good calcium load, and then you got the mycorrhiza package on there. So just an incredible foundation to start with, and then you're going to have the push. Fine, but
let me talk.
Undersold the calcium piece of that.
Yeah,
too.
I was just going to say that, Kevin.
Yeah.
Let me talk a little bit about that, because the raw material that we're using, I mean, so the way this works, and again, I think we've shared this on a podcast, but I think it's timely here, is that we're feeding these birds an awful lot of minerals because we're trying to keep their bodies working so they can produce eggs. But we're also feeding them an awful lot of limestone, but they digest that limestone and then it gets composted. So that calcium coming out of that product, along with all the other minerals, this is a mineral dense. And Kirk, we've been sharing the the mineral composition of the raw material.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
Loaded. It's incredible. It's just like, it makes you wonder. I was talking to a client yesterday, a lawn care client, and he's like, "Why would?" I know that you're biased because you work for EarthWorks, but take that hat off. And why would it not every lawn care owner just use 822 from a fertility standpoint? I'm like, it's got everything in there. It's completely safe. Your lawns are going to be glowing, and it's all in there. They overcomplicate it with these crazy analysis and trying to add in all these trace nutrient packages. And when he really gets it and he understands that inherently it is all in there. And I'm like, that's a great
more
point.
Importantly, what he's getting, especially in lawn care, is he's getting carbon. So we don't have a lawn care operator that we work with that is an organic. I mean, we have a very few maybe, but we're not trying to advocate being an organic lawn care. We're just trying to say, hey, there's a thing called the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you guys aren't using it. You're just burning everything out. What we're doing by putting down 1 or 2 applications of 822 in a lawn cycle of 5 or 6 applications is bringing carbon to the table, which allows a lot of our better lawn care operators to start reducing their inputs, which is just pure profit in their pockets. It's
Yeah.
all the agronomics. It's carbon to nitrogen, the most basic of all agronomic things. And this is not something that, EarthWorks or Joel Simmons or any of us came up with. This is basic agronomy 101. And that's why lawn care guys are saying, wow, yeah, I put that 822 down in the fall, and man, it was, I came out of the chute, I was working. I mean, it was really quite successful on what he was, what they were seeing. And that's why you're seeing the industry, going, we're going in leaps and bounds. I mean, it's just it's hard to keep.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail us there. We were talking.
That's all
about,
right.
Yeah. Yeah, we're talking lawn
We don't
care.
have a rail. There's no rail here.
Talking about the mineral package. Yeah.
Joel, you and I were talking earlier today about the value of ecolite in calcareous sands, and that's something Kirk and I see a lot of in the West. I mean, in typically
anything west of the Mississippi.
Yeah, in arid climates, I think we definitely see a lot more of that.
Yeah.
And what is the value of that with respect to those calcareous?
And this would be
situations?
this would certainly be true in aerification as well. But when you have a calcareous sand, so I mean, understand what a calcareous sand is. This is now sand made of a calcium material, not a silica. So when the laboratories come in, and any laboratory is most likely using a Melic 3 extraction, and it's a very strong acid. So on the soil test, what you're going to see is a very strong pull or a melting off of that calcium with that acid. So you're going to have the one you and I were talking about. I think they were in the 90s percentage wise of calcium.
They were.
So when you're in the 90s of calcium on a percentage basis, that means something is really deficient, and that something is going to be magnesium and potassium. And so what the biggest issue that I see, and I see this every time I talk to a client, is they're still going to bring sodium into the picture, but there's not enough potassium to buffer that sodium, and that leads to sodium-induced wilt stresses. And that's just, it's like a high blood pressure. So what the ecolite does, it has a very strong affinity for potassium. It's not a mineral that the plant's going to get potassium from, but it has an affinity for the potassium that is either in the soil or that you're going to apply, and it keeps it from either leaching through or volatilizing it up. And so what it does is it comes to the table building that potassium reservoir, and it's able then to fight that potassium sodium ratio. I remember building a course, probably in the early 2000s, and we put a lot of ecolite. Back in, when we started this, we were putting down 1,000 pounds of ecolite and 400 pounds of what was just called Renovate, which was without the ecolite in it. So we were getting a lot. Excuse me?
Per what?
Per 1,000 square feet. Tilled in.
I wanted you to clarify that.
Yeah, sorry about that. So 1,000 pounds per 1,000 tilled into maybe 6 to 8 inches with whatever equipment was available. But one of the properties, I remember this vividly. We came out of the chute because of all that ecolite with 15% potassium. And I remember some independent consultants who I have a lot of respect for, but are kind of overstuck on the base saturation model. They're like, oh my goodness, 15%. And we're looking at it, said the CEC is only 2 or 3. I mean, it's 15% of nothing. So, but we have potassium, and we have water holding capacity, and we have ammonium holding capacity, and we have porosity, and we have CEC. So the value that it brought to the table was significant. And it really built a foundation that allowed the superintendent to fight some of these things. So many times when we see sodium problems, it's not because it's so much sodium as it is it's too little potassium.
Not enough potassium. That's exactly right.
And it's hard. I mean, every superintendent in this country knows, when you have a real big potassium deficiency, it's a nightmare to try to change that. I mean, you can pound that soil with potassium sulfate every day, and you might not move that needle, a half a step. It's just very difficult. The ecolite will build a reservoir and give you some stability of that potassium and allow you to fight sodium.
It's funny you talk about those numbers, 1,000 pounds per 1,000, and when a turf manager hears that, he's thinking about his last fertilizer application, right? But on an average, let's say an average green is 5,000 square feet. I just did the math. That's over 350,000 pounds of sand in that root zone. So it's still a drop in the bucket, even if we're incorporating into the top 4 to 6. But it's amazing what that relatively small amount of amendment can really do for us.
We've never done, and this is my fault, but we've never been really good at truly qualifying and quantifying the success, and and you and I were talking about this, getting some stuff over to Sam Farrow's lab and really starting to quantify some of this. But we've seen this for 30 years now, and there's greens that we built 30 years ago that are still to this day really strong with some of these original amendments. Bethesda Country Club comes to mind. They built with us years and years ago, and they're still pretty solid. This is a sustainable approach, and it sounds like it's a lot, but again, it goes back to the fact that you've got one shot because the thing's open. You're not going to be able to put amendments in through an air fryer at the rate that you're going to be able to put.
Yeah.
So yeah, that 1,000 pounds sounds scary. And there's a price tag to it, but it's part of the investment. And that's the word that I think we love throwing around, and we hear it from superintendents, but it is part of the investment that gets this thing running. And it's, I don't think there's a better project that you can do than getting amendment. And I don't care if it's EarthWorks or something close to it or something along the line, but there's not a better investment that you can make when you're growing in a golf course or a sports field than getting a lot of good amendments that are well balanced, like we've been doing for all these years. I mean, it's the biggest ROI in the industry, and it's the biggest no-brainer.
So we talked a little bit about aeration, and I think we can kind of end on this, but we talked a ton about construction. Well, that's, even though there's a lot going on, that's still a pretty small percentage of what we're working with, right?
Yeah,
but everybody, whether it's a football field or a golf course green, everybody's doing some level of cultivation, whether it's dry jacked or traditional aerification. And we were talking offline prior to getting on this, that I've been around the business a while, and it seems like we're on our second cycle of how low can you go. And yet at the same time, we're not connecting the dots in a lot of cases that in the Pacific Northwest, anthracnose is rearing its ugly head again. In the Midwest, we're seeing still, not always have. I mean, there's going to be pressures, but we've seen a lot of dollar spot, outside the normal seasons even. And that could be, the way things are changing. But still, they're directly related to inputs as well.
Fertility.
So, when I first came out of college, it was just a given. If you were going to open up a hole, something had to go in it besides sand. And then as the late 90s kind of wore down, and the early 2000s, we moved away from that. Yeah. And here come all these diseases that we were having a hard time wrangling. And it's interesting, but same concept there, that you've got one chance, maybe two, depending on the climate and your club. You've got one or two chances a year to build that foundation again. So, Kirk, I assume you're seeing the same concept down there, where especially with ultra dwarfs, they're probably in them a couple times a year, right?
Oh yeah, all summer long, just beating the living hell out of them.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But it's getting worse in your marketplace. You've had some incredible summers in the last couple of years.
Oh, don't talk about it.
I know.
We're having a good spring.
It's April.
Next week. No, it's actually May.
It's May.
It's effectively May today.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, it is.
We're recording this on May 1. We might not broadcast it for a couple of weeks. But Kevin, I love that phrase, the as low as you can go. I mean, to me, it's one of the most dangerous things. I mean, it's like, it's the same analogy that we always talk about with human health. I mean, if you don't, have a decent diet, you're not going to be healthy. I mean, you might be able to walk around, and you might be, your hair might look good, but ultimately, you're going to get sluggish. And, it just doesn't make any sense. And it's, nobody in this industry is trying to over fertilize. I mean, that doesn't happen. And agronomists that are, the superintendents that are such good agronomists, they're not going to do that. They know how to make this happen. And I think, the industry has changed radically in the last 10, 15 years. And guys do understand that, but my favorite line of Kevin Hicks is, you can use less, just use the right less. And I have that on my board in front of my computer when I work, and, use the right less, because, that's what you want to do. You just want to make sure that the plant is getting what it needs so it can fight off the diseases. The microbiology in the soil is getting what it needs so it can fight off the diseases. But you're right. We're seeing dollar spot and anthracnose and bacterial wilt and all these things starting to come back. because I think, how low can you go is starting to take a bit of a hold, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and the concept of the right less, I mean, like you said, nobody's advocating for over fertilizing, but
No.
If we could take turf managers in general have so many stresses in their day-to-day careers.
Right.
If we could take one thing off your plate, wouldn't you want to do that?
Yes.
You're worried your whole staff's going to show up today. You're worried about
Right.
the member guest that's coming up. You're worried about the weather. You're worried about all these things. If we can make one thing in your life easier, can't we talk about that? And that,
Yeah.
that's always been my goal is I want to cross off as many things as I could as a golf course superintendent so that I could focus on the things that were really out of my control.
And not think about it.
Yeah. So it's been fun to see those success stories for sure. Both
And
on
they continue to
construction.
come. I mean, every year we see, I mean, we're probably in the middle of, I don't know what, Kirk, a dozen different construction projects right now. We got 4 or 5 going on in Florida. It's, I mean, it's they're,
coast to coast. Yeah.
Coast to coast. I mean, and people, the word of mouth on what we've done has been really, really strong. And we're grateful for everybody to share their stories. But, we just wanted to kind of qualify in this conversation what it is that we have been doing. But it's been successful. And it's, the nice thing about this is it's completely customizable to your needs, your budget, your environment. But, again, the bottom line, and I'll say this one more time, is that you've got one shot at getting this thing right. And if you can do it in the hole, man, that's the way to do it. If you can get that cavity filled up with something that's going to be sustainable, it's it's 10 years of work right there in 6 months.
Yeah. I think we've got the title of this podcast down.
Yeah.
I
Do we have a
think I beat
counter
it.
on that?
I think I beat it with a stick and it's bleeding on the street.
Well, let's wrap this one up. I think this went really well, and I appreciate you guys taking a little bit of time today, and hopefully everybody gets a little something out of it. I had a bullet point or two that I covered. So thanks again, everybody, for listening. And
let me end by saying, if you get onto our database of podcasts, we were just trying to go through a list. There must be at least a dozen to 20 golf course superintendents that we interviewed over the last 100 podcasts. Including people like Brian Bowl and Pete Wendt and Keith Wood and all these guys. They've all been on the podcast talking about their experience. So you can hear this from them. You don't have to hear it from us. There's a lot of folks that will be happy to share with you their experience and are completely committed to some level of amending when they go into kind of reconstruction.
Yep, for sure.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.